Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 15th, 1870, Congress votes to approve an annual $3,000 pension for Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of Abraham Lincoln. This was, of course, about 5 years after Lincoln had been assassinated, and Mary Todd Lincoln had spent a fair amount of that time lobbying for a widow's pension. Her rationale was that her husband had effectively served his country during wartime and paid the ultimate price with his life, and so in much the same way that any soldier or officer's widow gets a pension, she deserved one as well. There is a lot more to this story beyond just a fight for a pension. It is also, I think, a chance to talk about Mary Lincoln's troubled life, the way that she was portrayed in the public imagination, her troubles with money, for sure. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hey, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kelly, maybe let's back up a few years from this pension fight, just to lay out a little bit of context. And there's a lot we can say about Mary Todd Lincoln. I suppose we should start with money, because I do think that a lot of the scandals and ginned up and real around Mary Todd Lincoln do seem to involve her spending habits.
Yeah. She had extravagant taste. Let's just start with that. She liked to shop. She had accrued quite a bit of debt, not just in Washington, D.C., but really all over the country. And she needed income to not just pay off her debtors, but to survive. And so when we think about how much President Lincoln was getting, his salary at the time was about $25,000 a year, which seems like a lot of money. It was a lot of money back then. But she needs substantially more than that. She's about $27,000 in debt. So that's not going to be sufficient in order to pay off her debtors. So getting this pension was a way for her to try and sustain herself. It still doesn't allow her to pay off a good portion of her debt, but she would have guaranteed income coming in. And $3,000 was still significant. You know, most widows are not getting that kind of money. When I think about Harriet Tubman, who got a pension from her husband, the amount was only $240. Yeah. So this is not a lot of money, but it is also symbolic equally to being substantive to show that the federal government was going to take care of Lincoln's widow.
$3,000 in 1870 is about $60,000 today, just to add some context there. But Nikki, I mean, where do you come down on this narrative of Mary Todd Lincoln as bad with money, an extravagant spender? A lot of it seemed to be related to improvements to the White House, which cost a lot of money. But, you know, it was something that the press really liked to vilify her about. And so it just strikes me as this combination of, yes, there might be some truth, but it also seems to me to be a narrative.
It is absolutely a narrative that has a lot to do with her being a woman. You know, it is true that she spent a lot of money and she had a lot of debt. You know who else spent a lot of money and had a lot of debt? George Washington. Thomas Jefferson, right? That debt had been kind of people, especially elites, lived very differently, I think, in the 18th and 19th centuries. But in her case, you know, she had grown up in wealth, and in marrying Abraham Lincoln became part of a middle class more than an upper class, of course, until they enter the presidency. And Lincoln himself had this kind of homespun man of the people image, and she really cut against that. And the press leaned into that she was a harpy, that she was a spendthrift, that she was...
Wait, what's that word? A what?
A harpy? A harpy, that she was... I
don't know
she
that
was
one.
A nag. She was...
Oh, harpy.
That she was somebody who just like browbeat Lincoln, somebody who was loose with money, who was frivolous but also domineering. Like they didn't like her, and they made it very clear in the way they wrote about her, both before and after his death, because the stuff that they write after his death is times even worse.
Yeah, and it's even worse because there's no compassion, there's no empathy, there is no trying to understand a woman who not only witnessed her husband's murder at close point range, but also lost several children as well. And so she gets labeled as sort of hysterical or crazy, or a lot of her pain gets dismissed, we'll put it that way. And it's unfortunate because even if she was this, spendthrifty person, she still deserved quite a bit of care, especially after Lincoln's assassination.
Totally.
And we should say that she lost 3 of her 4 sons, and the second son that she lost was in 1862. It's in the middle of a war. Her husband is president and under a great deal of stress, as you might imagine, and she's just lost a child. And that is an incredible burden and an incredible trauma. And then she loses her husband. And then a few years after that, a 3rd son dies. Like, she is somebody who was dealing with quite a lot. And so if she had mental health issues, like it wouldn't be a surprise if she had them to begin with, but that they were exacerbated by this is super understandable.
What you're getting at is incredibly deep and important and complicated. I want to get back to it. I do want to put a couple little tidbits out there about the more sort of ridiculous scandals. I mean, for instance, there's this one, the old clothes scandal, which is, they don't name them like they used to. The old clothes scandal was basically she tried to sell some of the clothes that were lying around the White House at thrift stores, and she actually went to New York under an assumed name and tried to sell off some of her dresses, and was discovered. And certainly the tabloids, I think, loved this.
Yeah, I want to stay with that for a second, because this is actually in 1867, so it's a few years after Lincoln has been assassinated. Sorry. And let's tell that story a little differently. Here's this woman who has just been widowed, whose husband's estate hasn't been settled yet, who is in debt, who has lost her children, and she has these frocks laying around, and she thinks, I can sell my dresses so I can have some money. And she's so embarrassed by this. She doesn't want to be caught out, so she goes in disguise to try to sell them, and then it's revealed that she's doing this, and instead of people treating her with compassion, they're like, oh, look at her, the money grubber, just wanting to grub more money by selling her dresses.
But can I just say that Mary Lincoln is ahead of her time? Because let me tell you, if Jackie Kennedy was like, hey, I've got some dresses, like, people would be pining for these items. I mean, pining. So again, the cultural sort of precedent of, having estate sales or selling your old belongings was not there culturally, or was not, something that people did. But if you think about it, it's ingenious. I mean,
throw those up on Instagram.
Who would want to have a Elizabeth Cluckley original? Love it.
And we should point out that this moment when she is trying to sell these dresses and it becomes this scandal, that is actually the exact moment where she also is lobbying for this pension, and it takes her a number of years to finally convince it. But that's what we're sort of commemorating on this episode, is when she finally gets her pension. But there is this 3-year period, 1868 to mid 1870, where she is trying to convince the federal government that she deserves some sort of restitution for her husband's death. So on that point, what is your sense of I guess, her argument that her husband gave his life in service to the country during a war, and therefore she qualifies as a war widow? And what is your sense of how that argument ended up prevailing in this case?
I mean, I think it's completely legitimate. Completely legitimate. They were married for 23 years. They spent a good portion of the most difficult years of their marriage at war and losing children. I think that the country had a responsibility to at least ensure that she could sustain herself financially. And she wasn't asking them to pay off all of her debts. She wasn't asking them to pay her creditors or set up a foundation or things of, she's asking for a pension. And that to me seemed very practical. I think she could and should have asked for more. But the fact that she got it, or the fact that she had to fight so hard to get it, I think is unfortunate.
Yeah, and she was, Lincoln was the commander-in-chief. Even if he was a civilian leader, he was clearly part of the war effort. So she classifies in that sense. I wonder how much, in addition to sort of the way that the public had turned against her in some ways, or at least the press had turned against her in some ways, it was also about the idea of the presidency, the resistance to this, because presidents didn't get a pension at this point. They don't start getting a pension until it's clear that Harry S. Truman, who after he leaves the presidency is kind of insolvent, that they are like, we need to do something so that our presidents don't live in poverty. And so, in the 1860s, presidents aren't getting pensions. There's a sense that it's supposed to be this selfless service. And so if some of that isn't carried on in the argument against her, although they ultimately relent and pay her this widow's pension.
Yeah.
But I think, that's perhaps another episode, but how a lot of presidents left the White House broke, Jimmy Carter is another perfect example. They have to write a book in order to make money. Ulysses S. Grant had to write a book in order to make money. So
Truman does too.
Yeah. So I don't know. Should you have to write a book in order to sustain your wealth? That doesn't make sense. But it certainly set a precedent of presidents writing books in order to generate wealth for them after their term was over.
So as we start to wrap up, this is the first time we've talked about Mary Todd Lincoln on the show. I'm sure we will cross paths with her again. But, any thoughts on the latter part of her life? She continues to live a very rocky life, even after, she does get this pension, but she continues to live a very rocky life.
Yeah, she spends a lot of time abroad because she has a lot of debts and she is hiding from some of them. And she comes back home, and in 1875, she has one remaining son, and she is worried that he's sick or that he's going to be hurt. Understandable, again, given all of the traumas that she's lived through. And she goes and she tells him this, and he actually has her committed to a mental institution based on her spending, based on her fears about him, and she spends several months in a mental institution until she is finally sort of able to petition that she is in her right mind and able to be let go and have her freedom again. But it's it's not a great moment in her life.
Yeah. Well, one tidbit about that moment, she reportedly didn't even know about the trial until that day, and then is brought to a courtroom, and there's a trial while she sits there quietly, and a jury of 12 men decides that she's insane, and they sent her to an institution. Yeah. She does go to Europe again after that, and then her health starts to decline, and in 1882, she dies at age 63 back in Springfield, Illinois. As we wrap up, I think it's worth pointing out, and I think we've mentioned this on the show before, but one other little interesting tidbit when we're talking about Civil War pensions, you can't let a show that circles around this without mentioning this, which is that just last year, the last person who was collecting a Civil War pension died. But up until the year 2020, there was a living American collecting a Civil War pension.
That's crazy.
Kelly, Nikki, remind people how that math shakes out.
So it's interesting. So her father, I believe, was 84 years old, and he was a Civil War veteran, and so he was collecting the pension. And she was born in, I believe, 1930. Mm-hmm. So that when she was born, she was entitled to his benefits and received them. I wonder how much they were, gosh. And received these benefits up until the day that she died. So effectively becoming the oldest person to receive a pension from the Civil War.
Yeah, if they were tied to inflation.
I'm trying to look it up.
Yeah, I
now.
know.
So
Let's hope, 'cause otherwise.
Yeah, I just looked it up. Irene Triplett earned $73.13 a month up until last year when she died. But that's how you get that.
There you go.
That's how you get that math. You have a very
That's
old
not even
father, and you
groceries.
live for a long time. It isn't even groceries. That's correct. Okay, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from